I was thinking about this slide. It's funny. I got this idea from Doug Moo. I had him for exegetical Greek back in the late 90s, and the class was talking about the history of redemption. And I think it was in the context of N.T. Wright's book, The New Testament and the People of God, which I recommend to everybody who can get through the sentences. It's an extremely dense book. Kind of revolutionized my understanding of the New Testament a little bit. But in that context, he was trying to describe the difference between the modern mind, which is very individualistic and self-oriented, and that gets transposed into biblical, or gets translated into biblical interpretation, where everything becomes the person and God. So everything is interpreted and applied based on the person and God. So it's how is a man justified before God, right? What does this have to do with my life? How does this apply to me? What does this mean for me? It's that kind of thing, which we're all trained to think since birth in our culture. So that's that vertical line right there. But in the New Testament, you don't see that. This was Moo's point. He just scribbled this on the board. He scribbled the basic outline of this on the board, which is those two arrows. And I even switched the direction of the arrows. But it was just the two arrows. And I think he had a man and God above and below. And then a timeline, an arrow pointing to the right instead of to the left. And so that really stuck with me, because it really changes your approach to interpreting the Bible when you get out of that sort of individualistic, propositional approach to studying the New Testament. What propositions can I pull out of this? What can I say about David in general, for example, in 1 Samuel? What can I say about David in general that I can transport 3,000 years into the future that matters today? And so when you then end up extracting him out of his context, and you empty him of the meaning of the times, the reason he mattered back then, so that you can make him matter today. And something gets lost in translation over the course of 3,000 years in his case. And so that's what this is getting at. And so what you see in Luke and Acts, and then I added, that's me, that's not Moo. And then I added Romans, since I've been studying particularly 9 through 11. And the question isn't so much how is a man or a person or me, how am I justified before God through faith and so on and so forth. It's a very Luther way of approaching it. But rather the questions that they're tackling have to do with those three below the line. What has God been doing in the past? What is he doing now? And what does this have to say about the people of God? Who are the people of God? And that last question is exactly the issue in Romans 9 through 11. He has delved 100% into the question, given what has happened, and the transformative arrival of the transformative birth of the Messiah, what has happened to the people of God? How do we make sense of it? Because we thought we always knew Israel was the people of God, but all of a sudden, Gentiles are streaming in, and Israel has rejected their Messiah. And there's all kinds of implications for that. So you'll notice that the arrow is pointed to the left, and the reason is they understood. They didn't really see the arrow going forward. I mean, the arrow was going forward, but what they understood what was happening going forward based on a reading of the prophetic word in the past. So it was always this reflective looking backward. And that's why we've been focusing so heavily on, for example, Isaiah, because they used Isaiah to understand who Jesus was. It's particularly in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, which just Isaiah, of course, permeates the book. You don't get past the first couple of verses of Mark without a quotation from Isaiah, for example. So anyway, I was thinking about that, and Luke chapter 1, which I read last week because I listened to the feed again this morning, and you can see it in his intro. Since many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, he says, the things accomplished among us. What a remarkably generalized reflective statement. Now for Luke, the past included the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection and exaltation of the Messiah. And now he has inherited, as a Gentile writer, Gentile convert, second generation, he never knew Jesus. He has now inherited that tradition, that prophetic tradition as well. It's as much his as it is, maybe that's a little overstatement, but it's as much his as it is Paul's.
What do you mean by the second generation?
Luke, to our knowledge, had never been to Jerusalem before Paul's visit there at the end of his ministry, just before he went to Rome. So he's a second generation Christian. How he became a Christian, we don't know. But he was brought the gospel and he responded to it. And he incorporated it into whatever he believed before. In my view, he was almost certainly a God-fearing Gentile. And now he doesn't seem to think like a pagan who converted to Christ. He seems more like a God-fearing Gentile who was very, very well versed in the prophetic tradition, who now believes in the Messiah and now understands the Messiah within that context.
Wouldn't it make it first generation?
No, the first generation is Peter, James, John. That's the first gen. That's the eyewitnesses. That's his point here.
Oh,
Just as the accounts, the things accomplished among us were handed down to us, second generation, by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses.
I'm thinking in a different context.
Right?
Yeah.
So the traditions were handed down to them and they believed in them. And now they propagate those traditions. And he ends up on the missionary journeys of Paul. But they received that message from the first generation, probably. Paul received, of course, his message direct. My hunch is direct from Jesus on more than one occasion, with some blanks filled in. But
So that makes him first generation.
No, that makes Paul. He transcends all that, right? He was he was a witness to the resurrection. So if you call first generation Christian a witness to the resurrection, then he was a first generation Christian. But he too never knew Jesus in his lifetime. But I'm not saying so much about them. I'm just talking about here's a Gentile who never knew Jesus, who may have never been to Jerusalem prior to Paul, him going with Paul after the third journey, who fully inherited the prophetic tradition in understanding the things accomplished among us. And now it's just one continuous timeline of the things accomplished among us. And he quotes the Old Testament over and over and over again. Luke does, in Luke. And in the sermons in Acts, the preaching in Acts, you'll see the Old Testament quoted as well. Very high concern for him. But anyway,
so the timeline starts with the thing where for the things accomplished.
No, the timeline for Luke is way, way back. Before this, the timeline for Luke is this. I mean, he's dealing in Abraham. He's inherited the traditions about Abraham and everything. And he understands who Jesus was and what he accomplished. He understands the things accomplished among us based on his reading, now inspired, of everything that happened before that. The prophetic word and all of it, the promises made to Abraham and so on and so forth. That's how he understands that stuff.
So us is basically God's people. Among us.
That's a good question. The us would be, when he says that, us, the things accomplished, handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. He seems to be saying that he spoke personally. He could be talking about he personally had transformative interaction with these first generation eyewitnesses. Or he could just be talking about, it moves and it moves and it moves, but we're all recipients of the message that was started with the eyewitnesses. He could mean either one of those, but at any rate, his point is, to Vic's point, the things accomplished among us is that's got to be wider in scope than Jerusalem and what happened in Jerusalem, because he wasn't there. So he's talking about this sort of comprehensive, this gospel propagation for the Gentiles. the things accomplished among us Gentiles. He's talking to Theophilus, who's another Gentile, surely a Roman.
Example of that right here is when Christ appeared the second time to, the first time he appeared, Thomas wasn't there. And when the disciples told Thomas, well, with Jesus here, he said, I won't believe until I see nails in the hand and the pierced in the side. And when Jesus appeared to him the second time, a week later, first thing he said to Thomas was, you believe, you want to see nails? And he goes, no, I believe. And then Jesus said, the same thing, you saw and see me. What about those people that have not seen me and still believe? And that's basically what he's kind of talking about right here.
Is it in that passage that he says, blessed are those who do not see and believe?
Right, yeah. That's when he was talking to Thomas, the second time. It's like, yeah.
Yes.
Basically, that's kind of what that's saying right there. Those still believe that they have seen me.
The kingdom advances through the hearing of the word of God. Ear to ear to ear. Right? That's how it advances. It doesn't advance because a lot of people saw him while he was alive. A dot of people. This very, very small dot of people in history ever saw him alive, either before or after the resurrection.
Could we replace those words with an account of the history of redemption?
No, I don't think so. I think he's about to launch on a story of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. That's the things accomplished among us, which have transformative, which have what's the right word there? Sort of cosmic significance. But in order to understand their cosmic significance, you have to go back to the prophets, which is what he's going to do. He's going to recount a story of the things accomplished among us, Jesus, but viewed in light of prophetic fulfillment from beginning to end. So he's going to open with an angel who's going to allude to 2 Samuel 7, and he will close with such a stark picture of Isaiah chapter 53 that you cannot possibly miss it. It just permeates the thing.
So the accomplished things are the things that were fulfilled?
Yes. The things that fulfilled those promises are the things that are accomplished among us. Yeah. I think that's what, I mean, that's all you get. You just get the statement. And then he moves on. After having investigated everything carefully, come on, Luke, can you be more specific, please? Who, what, when, where, and why? Who did you talk to? What did you talk about? How far back? We're Westerners. We like to think like that. But this is about the gospel. This is about the subject of the gospel, who is the Messiah for the nations, not just for the Jews. And now here's one Gentile who wrote over 25% of the New Testament. Repeat it because it's amazing. Not something we would ever do. Over 25% of the New Testament was written by a Gentile who never knew Jesus. I would have had apostles write the Gospels. But so far as we know, we only got 2 Gospels from apostles. It's not the way I would have done it, but who am I,
So is the orderly? Maybe not that.
No, I'm just talking. I'm not trying
I
to.
was wondering if the early account is the letter.
Luke and Acts. Yeah. Which was too big to put on one scroll. So he divides it in half, probably. And then I've added Romans because of the fact that it is so clearly a dialogue with Moses, with the law. What do we do then given what happened, given faith, which I've been talking about, says Paul, since chapter 3, given faith, what do we do what about the law? What are the implications as far as the law go in Moses? And if the law has been, in some sense, no, in a very clear sense, overthrown, if Moses has been overthrown through faith, in favor of faith, then what does that say about Israel, who rejected its Messiah? are they still the people of God? Because they're still attached to Moses and they rejected their Messiah. They rejected Jesus, the Christ appointed for them, as Peter says early in Acts. They rejected him.
Remnant,
And his answer is going to be in response to that, no, God always keeps his promises, and I'm a down payment on that promise, says Paul, because I'm part of the remnant. I too am an Israelite. Here I am. But recipients of the blessings of I'm a recipient of the blessings of the covenant, not through Moses, but through faith. Because through Moses, which is to say the law, you get condemnation. Through faith, you get justification, and you inherit the blessings that the blessings that were promised to Abraham, because through faith you are placed within the covenant. You're placed within the confines of the covenant. And you are no longer, as he says in Ephesians chapter 2, having no hope, aliens to the covenants and the promises, having no hope and without God in the world. But God, there it is, reconciled. And through Christ, he has broken down the dividing wall, which is the law, and he has placed you in a kingdom where you will inherit the blessings of those covenant promises. And that's the story. But you notice hardly any theology in there that I've spoken explicitly right there. But these guys were not systematic theologians sitting around discussing the bullet points. Well, we got to have a creed. So we got to come up with 10 bullet points of theology about Jesus and 10 bullet points of theology about salvation. No, they were in a scrum to figure out what on earth is happening. And then out of that, what do we draw from that? But first you got to know what happened. You got to figure it out. And part of that figuring out is, what on earth do we do with Israel? What is God doing with Israel? What's happening on this timeline? And that's, that brings us to Romans chapters 9 through 11, which, as I've said before, often viewed rather indifferently because of who we are as modern Protestants. What matters to us is 1 through 8, and particularly chapter 3. You do a comparison of the number of sermons done on chapter 3 of Romans versus the number of sermons done on all of chapters 9 through 11 in the history in the last 100 years. It's, I don't know what the ratio is, but it's going to be 10,000 to 1. Every Sunday, there's churches all across the land, somebody's doing a sermon on Romans chapter 3 or chapters 8 or something. But there ain't people doing sermons all across the land every Sunday on Romans chapters 9 through 11. It's just the way it is. I'm not even sure I've ever heard one. I don't think I've ever done one, which means I should do one. I got to have a place to do one, but okay. So who are the people of God? That's the question at hand. In Acts, as God reconstitutes the people of God, takes the gospel to the Gentiles, as the Jews in Jerusalem and Judea rejected it. Gospel now advances across Gentile territory. In the midst of that, of course, a remnant of Jews also come to Christ through faith, among whom were, for example, Aquila and Priscilla. And then there's other, you can go to the end of these letters. Those end of the letters are interesting because they give a bunch of names and you can tell the Jewish names. So you can see who's still there. But it's pretty clear that increasingly the church across the empire is Gentile and not Jewish. And that's going to pick up speed after 70 when Jerusalem is destroyed. And then by the end of the century, and then with the Bar Kokhba rebellion, it's a Gentile church. And we await to see what will happen next. We await with anticipation the next thing, because that's what Paul is getting at. I got to see if somebody's, why did I do that? Somebody's trying to get in the feed or something. No. Okay. That's the deal. So here we are at the end of chapter 11. He has reached, in some sense, more than just the end of this discussion of Israel. He has reached the end of whatever it is that he started with that intro statement Think about that. Think about the territory that he's covered. Without ever defining it, I am not ashamed of the gospel. He says to a church of people he's never met. He knows some people there, but he's never been to Rome. He doesn't know this church. But he just calls it the gospel, like they're expected to understand what he means. For it is the power of God for salvation. He never defined salvation. To everyone who believes, now we want to individualize that. Every individual who believes around the world, through all time and all places, every individual, he's not going to let you go that direction. He's going to make sure you understand what he's thinking. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. It's the overriding interest and preoccupation of New Testament, I don't know what you want to call it, emphasis. It's consistent in Paul's letters and Acts. It's hinted at in Luke, but in Paul's letters and Acts, particularly, this thing about a people of God unified, consisting of both Jew and Greek, as the gospel now through faith moves to Gentiles, into Gentile territory. For in it, the righteousness of God, without ever defining it, we want definitions, is revealed, doesn't talk about how it's revealed, from faith to faith. Every one of these phrases is a whole PhD dissertation. It's 1,000 PhD dissertations that are written on every one of these phrases. As it is written, and then he quotes from Habakkuk, the righteous man through faith, as it says, and I think in the NIV, the righteous man through faith, the one who is righteous through faith will live. And off we go. And whatever he started here, he seems to be now reaching the end of, at the end of chapter 11. That's kind of a bracket, because in chapter 12, it's going to be a dramatic shift in subject matter. He's going to switch from the indicative, describing indicative to imperative. We'll talk about that later. It's a dramatic shift in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. And he moves on from there. Picks up some themes that he hinted at in chapter 6. But this statement right here then, verse 25, do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery. Brethren here is Gentile brethren, not Jewish brethren. It's always pays to ask that question when you see a New Testament author use the word brethren. In Hebrews, it becomes very difficult to understand, to figure out whether he means brethren, Jewish brethren, because they appear to be Hebrews, Jews, or is he talking brethren as Christians? But here, clearly, he wants to stop brethren, Gentiles, that a partial hardening, not a permanent hardening, the hardening in part, there is a remnant, and it's temporary, has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and thus all Israel will be saved. So Paul's saying, no, God hasn't given up on his promise. He hasn't given up on Israel. He hasn't reneged on him any more than he did during the period of the Judges, or the 350-year disaster of the divided kingdom, when the northern kingdom did not have one single good king. It's like 0 for 20. And the southern kingdom was like 6 for 20 or 21 or something like that. It's just an unmitigated disaster, rebellion, idolatry, and so on and so forth.
So he's still speaking collectively when he says, so all Israel will be saved. It's not every Jew is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, you got to get out. Yeah, it's difficult for us to do. We see all, and we want to interpret that as every single one. And I've read books like that every single one. Well, yeah, except for all the ones who died before that event. It doesn't really, you get your every single one, but it's not every single one because so many died prior to. But the nation, there's going to be some kind of transformative turning of Israel, which will be the point. The point would be then it's the evidence that God has not given up on his people. That's the point. Remember how this all started, right? Chapter 9. No. Oh, chapter 11. Go. let's see. Did they stumble so as to fall? Verse 11. May it never be. He just doesn't tell you why at that point. But no, has God rejected his people? No, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. I forget where that is, but that's somewhere in here too. So now he makes it explicit towards the end here. God will save Israel. And it doesn't have to mean every single one of them. This means just any more than it did in the past. It just means Israel. Israel will now be known as the nation committed to its Messiah. Then there's this great reversal synchronism that goes on here in verses. First of all, in 29, there it is. There it just says it straight up. The gifts and the calling of God upon Israel, and in all cases, that's both a general, universal statement about the way God is, and also it's a statement about Israel that pertains to Israel in particular. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, cannot be revoked. For just as you once were, here's the symmetry, just as you were once disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience. So these also, Israel, now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they may also be shown mystery. For God has shut up all in disobedience, including the Jew, so that he may show mercy to all. And this is what's going to lead to the acclamation, one of Paul's great acclamations of God, blessings of God, the blessedness of God. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. The true Jew comes out. Paul, Pharisaical Jew. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, who has ever counseled him? Who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him, there's your creator, and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen.
Does this passage give any insight as to what's happening in our college campuses in regard to Jews?
None that I'd be willing to put bet money on. Does this passage have anything to say about what happened with the Holocaust? What happened after that, in 1947 and 8, when Israel became a state again for the first time since 37 BC? The last time Israel was an independent state was 37 BC, just before the Romans came in. Pompey took it back over. So what is that? It's talking let's do the math. 1948 to minus 37, or plus 37. 2,000 years. Almost around 2,000 years. That's how long they were not a nation, not a people, a dispersion across the world. They were a dispersion. And then there's a regathering in 1948, which continues to this day. Or what does that have to do with what he's talking about in 11? I'm willing to say only that it means that after all that time and everything that's happened, including 1941 to 1945, there's still a nation of Israel. And that is remarkable. And I think the only way you can explain that is through the providence of God. That's not in the Bible, but it's this extraordinary thing.
It seems like there's a tremendously growing hatred toward Jews and Christians.
There's not a growing hatred towards Jews. There's an abiding hatred towards Jews. You can go back in Europe, you can go back to Luther's period. At least, I mean, that's as far back as my knowledge of the thing goes, but even back then, it was very much alive.
Would it be abiding for Christians too, or is that growing?
That's growing.
In our country?
Yeah, Christians, yeah, that's growing. But for different reasons, very different reasons. There's lots of books written on this kind of thing. The Christian value set, the Christian God and also the Jewish God, but the Christian God is repulsive, is increasingly, you might think of it that way. The Christian God is increasingly repulsive to the modern value set of equality, of I mean, there's all kinds of what's a good word to sum, well, equality. To the idea that there should not be differentiation. That the modern value set revolves around the idea that that humanity is an undifferentiated mass of sane people that are only superficially different. But at least that's the public value set. And so now I'm really talking off the top of my head, but you know, this idea that there's no difference, but there's no real difference between people, and never is that more.
And that's why we
Prominent.
want equity.
Equity is the
Everybody
word.
gets
They've
treated
changed,
the same.
they've changed the word from equality to equity. That's why I paused for a minute. Equity's become the new word. It infects all of the normal virtue, the words of virtue, like justice. You know, justice now means something different in our culture than it did 100 years ago.
The word inclusive is kind of interesting.
Inclusivity, diversity, but the diversity idea is in their minds, at least publicly, strictly. I'm talking off the top of my head again. You know, there's a superficiality, the way that they talk about it. But they try to fit everybody, they try to act like everybody can fit in the same mold. And we end up here. So, you know, men and women, it's never more obvious than with men and women. You know,
In some ways, the word inclusive seems to be used exclusively, because they exclude Jews, Christians, and some.
they exclude more than that. And even the term diversity is strange, because if you take the way that when I read a lot and I listen to a lot on this, but if you took a room full of 100 African Americans, they would call that diversity. If you took a room full of 100 white Americans, they would say that is not diversity. That's their understanding of diversity. We should probably get back to the text, because we're not political, we're getting close to it though.
Yeah.
I have no problem talking about that stuff because it has to do with values. When you end up in a world where truth itself is relativized and personalized and subjectivized, so that everybody has their own truths, then whoever has the most power is going to want to enforce their truths. And if you try to disagree with their truth, they're gonna say that you're forcing your truth on them. But of course, their truth is the abiding truth. And that's where it's a very Marxist. It's the one with the power has the truth. It's as Marxist as it could be. And that's the world that we live in right now. In my view, that's the world we live in right now.
And in the midst of all this stuff that we're seeing, understanding a passage like this gives us peace.
Yeah, so now it doesn't matter if you want to live in your little fantasy world that you have you have some sort of sovereignty in this world. Go ahead. Let's see how that works out for you. There is a sovereign one, and he has a capital S in front of that for him. And he has not abdicated that sovereignty. He just hasn't. And when he's had enough, when he wants to do something different, when he wants to take the world in a different direction, he simply does so. And there's no voting. There's no polling what people think. You either get on board or you might have a miserable time of it anyway. But it's better to be miserable and obedient than miserable and disobedient. It's better to be miserable and one of God's children than to be let alone. Better than to be happily not one of God's children, or worse, miserably not one of God's children. That's a really miserable place to be. Because the world can turn on you in a second. You have your way, you think you've got it, And you think, just like Hitler did with the 1,000-Year Reich, remember the 1,000-Year Reich lasted how long? Anybody know how long the 1,000-Year Reich lasted? This is how it usually goes. 13 years. That's how long a 1,000-Year Reich lasts. It lasts 13 years. And it doesn't end with a whimper, it ends with a bang. A big one.
I love verse 36.
Yeah, let's get back to it. I probably shouldn't do that, especially since it's recorded now, but whatever. Okay, let's just move on to it. But we can definitely say that we finished chapter 11. And then we start fresh with chapter 12. I do want to point out in 31, the artistic symmetry of the history of redemption. As God calls a people into being, Israel. Israel now is in some sense set aside so that he can call into being a new people of God by first bringing in the Gentiles, after which he will then tie up the loose end and bring Israel back in. And we have once again the grand reunification of the people of God in Christ. That's the plan. That's the one I bought into. It's the one I'm waiting for. Okay, let's see. What else have I got to say about this? Let's just go look through a couple of these quotes. Let's see. One more statement on 32. Can't move on. Hellenistic Jew, I wrote this out. Hellenistic Jews throughout the eastern provinces. That's these provinces. These are the eastern provinces. Right here, where the gospel propagated, where Paul's missionary journeys were, because that's all we know about. But they had been indoctrinated. The Jews had indoctrinated the Gentile converts into the mindset that they must always be second-class citizens among the people of God, the ethnic Jews, by virtue of blood in Moses. And the ethnic Jews must always have a privileged position, and that God would enforce that caste division, C-A-S-T-E. Caste division spiritually, religiously, in status before God. Paul, a devoutly Orthodox, Mosaic, Pharisaical, rabbinical Jew, arrives in the synagogue to announce that neither blood nor ethnicity nor Moses nor the law was of any consequence among the people of God. Worse than that, among the children of Abraham. Blood gets you nowhere in Abraham. What a remarkable thing to think, because by definition, a Jew was a child of Abraham. So that's, yes, people had questions about that. It's upsetting at that time, 2,000 years of history of Israel. On to 33 and so forth with this acclamation. I got some of these quotes. We'll just pull out and look at them real quick. Guess where they come from, mostly. Guess where they come from. Anyone want to guess what books these come from, mostly? Yeah, Isaiah. You never leave it much. Isaiah 15:5-9. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. I hope I read this carefully. There's this kind of thing, right? My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as high as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. It's as Jewish thing as he could possibly think. It's very, very, not just unpagan, but anti-pagan. The idea that there is a God who stands categorically above every other being, period, and is in that sense not understandable, not fathomable, not searchable. To the pagans, they would not have understood that. But he did as a Jew. 40. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? 12. Marked off the heavens by the span, you're hinting at this creator thing again. Calculated the dust of the earth by the measure, weighed the mountains in a balance. See how small the creation is in the mind and hands of God. The hills in a pair of scales. Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or who has, or as his counselor has informed him? In other words, I would just make a comment on that. Who has ever taught God anything? What creature can ever make the claim that God learned something from me? That God was somehow improved by me? With whom did he consult, and who gave him understanding? No one. Who taught him in the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and informed him of the way of understanding? And the rhetorical answer is absolutely no one who ever lived. Mu says, no human being can understand what God is doing in the world. And if you want to disagree with that, it probably won't last long. We're awful at reading the present, reading the landscape. We're not good at reading the landscape of today, anticipating tomorrow, or figuring out what happened, or even reading what God had to say about it in books like Isaiah. That's one of the reasons the Jews rejected their Messiah. They did not understand what it was that happened. When the two on the road to Emmaus were talking to Jesus without knowing it, there it is. There's the ignorance. They didn't even know it. The Son of God is standing next to them. Nuts. The 24th. Oh, I'm the next. Look at his chastisement again. He saunters on up. What are you guys talking about? Oh, the things that have happened. It's very similar to Luke's own language, right? Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days? It's so much like the things accomplished among us. I just noticed that. Are you the only one in Jerusalem that doesn't understand, doesn't unaware of the things accomplished among us, or something like that? The difference is Luke understands it. These two don't. He said, what things? They said to him, they got it so close. The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word. That's correct. We were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. They were looking to the right person. They just didn't understand really what redemption was, or even really what Israel was. Oh, foolish, here's the chastisement. Oh, foolish men, slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. We're not good in the future. We're not good in the present. We're not good in the past. We just aren't. Nobody at the time of Jesus knew who he really was. They had Messiah down, but they have a lot other than that. None of those people believed that he was the second person of the Trinity, God incarnate, who was going to die on the cross for their sins, overthrow the temple sacrifices, provide justification by faith, and take the gospel to the Gentiles. Nobody figured any of that out whatsoever. Only after not just the resurrection, but the outpouring of the Spirit. Was it not necessary? The most basic element of the doctrine of the gospel, was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer? And that these things, again, the Luke thing, and then to enter into his glory. They couldn't get to that one basic fact of the gospel, that the Christ would suffer. And you see it over and over again in Acts, that the Christ would suffer. Go back to it and back to it. The Christ would suffer. It's unthinkable to these people. That the king would be crucified. No human being can understand what God is doing in the world, and I would add that they cannot understand what he will do, nor what he has done. That's why we need the word of God. God never learns, and he doesn't have to. His ways are always perfect. He started perfect and he will end perfect, and that's our hope. Or who has first given to him, verse 35, that it might be paid back to him again? Who does God owe? Who can lay a claim on God? You owe me. I did this. Now we're deep into Job, probably. 41:11. Who has given to me, God says to Job, that I should repay him? Everything is mine. What are you going to give to me that I don't already have? He's never grateful because he's never enriched by any creature. He is pleased. He is pleased by the faith and faithfulness of his creatures, but he's never improved, let's use that word, by any creature. It's the mindset of the synagogue, anti-pagan way of thinking about God. There is one God who created the heavens and the earth. Hellenistic paganism held to the belief that the gods benefited from the services that their worshipers provided. So a lot of these people in Rome, they may have been pagans, like in Ephesus, and they were used to thinking about gods like in the temples, in the pagan temples. That's how they thought about it. And so you go and you perform these rituals. By virtue of doing the rituals, things happen. The gods are moved by virtue of doing the rituals. What you thought about them didn't matter. What mattered was that you did the ritual. That's what they're used to. Now he's writing to these people in Rome. And undoubtedly, there's some of those people in this church. And this is giving them the categorical difference between this God, the true God, and all the other gods. For from him, creator, through him, creator, to him, king, are all things. There's the all things again. To him be the glory forever. You know, it's this Jewish acclamation. You've got, I got this somewhere. You know, this, what do they call this? The doxology. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly hosts, right out of the Psalms. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. We have a creator. And that creator makes a claim, and he is never, ever wrong. And he will win. And that victory is already secured. God wins. He wins today, he wins tomorrow, and he wins the next day. No matter what happens in the world, he wins. And part of that winning will be after he has brought in the Gentiles, he will reclaim his people, so to speak, Israel. He's not forgotten about them. And until that day, they will not go out. They're not going out. They will not be extinguished. Not out of any merit on their own part, but because God has a plan. And it encompasses Israel. That's how I think of it. Anyway.
In Psalm 80, God talks about transplanting the vine from Egypt, how he prepared the ground that took root, and its branches reached as far as the sea and its shoots as far as the river. Makes me think of that phrase that the Palestinians are saying.
From the sea to the river?
Yeah, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free or whatever. But God made it, so it was going to take up that space.
Yeah, of course. Israel, the question then becomes in that context, is Israel promised the land today?
Well, it ends with restore us, O Lord.
No, I'm saying right now, in the present time, is Israel still promised that land? I'm not saying they
In the grand
should
scheme.
have it. I'm saying from a biblical perspective, given everything that's happened in Christ.
Yeah.
Which, if you say no, whether you say no or not, it appears that that land will be in play for Israel right to the bitter end.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that gets, man, there's people that will fight ferociously over those kinds of issues. So we'll back off from. I don't have any strong opinion about that. It's affect my thinking very much. So we'll go ahead and stop there. We finished chapter 11. Come to the end of it. If you turn the page, boy, does it change. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And you go, whoa. Really different. And then it really takes off. After that, he's going to talk about government in the next chapter. Bless those who bless, curse, do not, bless those who persecute, do not bless and do not curse. You know, these rapid fire little admonitions one after another. And he'll go on and just takes off. Very, very different. They argue all the time about, well, that sounds like a whole new letter. This isn't Paul. It's got different vocabulary. This is somebody else wrote this, and somebody stuck it at the end of Paul's letter ends at chapter 11, and then somebody stuck this at the end of it. You know, and then they start talking about the possibilities of multiple letters, which I don't discount. We'll talk about that when the time comes. Anyway, that's the end of it. We finished it 1 through 11 in however many weeks this is. Not bad. A lot of people have shipwrecked their Sunday school classes by never being able to finish Romans. We finally got the check, and I would be one of those. I did it in the 90s. I've started Romans a lot, but I don't know that I've ever finished it. If we do it here, it'll be the first time I think the first time I've ever finished Romans, which means I've never taught what we're about to go through. We'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks for showing up.